Hey guys, it's now time to move on to a pretty important section of the text, which I'm going to say has been questioned many, many times in an exam. And we're looking at what we call the way we perceive, and we're looking at the wax argument, which is an argument or an example that has been used to point out how we perceive. So, think about exam questions. They're pretty important. What's our overall goal? Well, we're going to explore the role of the mind in perceiving, because a lot of people think that perception just involves the senses. But from Descartes' point of view, we're going to see how he argues the opposite. We're going to look at these three small goals. We're going to outline Descartes' reflection on how we perceive objects. We're going to explore why Descartes argues that the mind alone perceives. And then we're going to explore why Descartes argues that the mind can be better known than the body. So write those down, pretty please, with the cherry on top. And once you've written them down, can you score yourself, please? Give each one a give each one a mark between 1 and 4. And then once you've done that, draw a diagram just off the top of your head that tells me how you think we engage in the action of perceiving physical objects in the material world. Once you've done all that, you're ready to move on to the next bit. Okay, so once Descartes has thought about or come to the conclusion that we are a thinking thing, he then goes and he moves on to another question. And that question is, what about the material world? What's our relationship with the material world? Because he's 100% sure that we are a thinking thing. We can establish that with certainty. But what is the relationship between the mind and the way that the physical world works, or how the physical world appears to us? So that's what he is aiming to do in this section. Take a note. So he says that material objects like the body or chairs or any objects in general, they appear to be much more distinct when we just do a basic reflection on them. So he wants to know, well, okay, how do we perceive these objects? And more important, how do we know these objects are actually the objects in question? So take a note. And the first thing he explores in order to deal with this issue is, how do we actually know that the beeswax, before it's melted and it's in a honeycomb structure, is actually the same as the melted beeswax in this pot? How do we actually know that the two things are the same? And this is what we call the wax argument. We're using the wax argument to look at how perception actually occurs. So first, when we look at actual beeswax, we know what it is through the senses. The senses trigger it off, and they tell us, look, it has shape, color, or more importantly, he says things like it has extension and form and color. Yeah, but basically the senses let us know that this object has these certain qualities, and we sense them through the senses: shape, color, smell, taste, texture, feeling, everything like that. But what happens when we melt that same object, when we melt it down? All of a sudden, the qualities that the senses detect have completely changed. We now have a new, instead of hardness, I guess we have softness. There's a new taste, a new smell, new set of colors, new shapes and or extension and form. The properties that we sense with our senses are completely different. But somehow we know that the melted wax is the same as the solid beeswax before it was melted. Take a note. Alright, so how do you know that the beeswax in its solid form is exactly the same thing as the melted beeswax? Or that this beeswax was melted and became the melted beeswax? How do you know that? Well, if it was based on the senses, all you could really know is that something had changed, and what had basically changed was its substance. You'd also know that it was it had extension, and that it was quite flexible. So you saw change, you saw flexibility, and you saw extension. But your senses really wouldn't have told you anything else when you saw the wax melt. That's what they would have told you. So if you knew that, then if you basically saw the change, you couldn't make the actual conclusion that basically the two different states of the wax are both wax. You couldn't do it. So there had to be something else besides perception, which actually tied together all the new properties and gave them one singular identity. And you guessed it. Well, it might be mind. But before he explains mind, he says, okay, well, let's try and have a look at imagination. Is imagination what we use to be able to understand that the melted wax and the solid wax are the same thing? Let's have a look at what he said. Well, melted wax, it mutates, but when it mutates, it can mutate into many different shapes and forms and colors and have an infinite variety of properties that we just could never really predict if we used the imagination to predict them. So, it can't be imagination at all, because imagination is just not possible. Or it takes too much effort to predict the infinite array of changed qualities of the beeswax once you melt it. Take a note. So the only way that you can really know that the wax is the same thing is because you understand that it is the same thing. In other words, you judge and you look at what's happening and you make the connections mentally between the different states of the wax. And your brain and your understanding of what wax is actually ties together what the senses observe, giving you that perception. In fact, it's more like your mind connects all the different observations together around an understanding and all the other possible details that we haven't really captured in this example, but what you would tend to observe when the wax actually melts. But you have to acknowledge that that's an infinite amount of details depending on the infinite amount of circumstances that changes the qualities of the wax once it melts. So really, the only thing that can tie together all these perceptions is an understanding, and that understanding is performed by the mind. And this is why he argues that the wax is perceived by the mind alone. Take a note. So the logical extension is basically that objects are perceived by the mind, and the superficial properties of those objects are perceived by the senses. So obviously the senses trigger the mind to understand what an object is, but the mind performs the action of perception through understanding. And a good analogy he uses to get there is he imagines that he's in a building looking down on people who are all wearing coats and hats. And he can't actually see the faces or any kind of other details. Now, what he would see would be basically coats and hats. He would not see anything other than that, but he knows, because his mind can perform the action of understanding, that really there are people walking down on the street. Okay? And this is very similar to the way that perception and mind work when observing the wax. Alright? Similarly, you perceive the shape, the colors, the superficial qualities of the senses, but tying them all together and making them meaningful and understanding what they are is performed by the mind. The mind understands that it is the wax. Just like, well, in this analogy, hats and coats are to people as the superficial properties of the wax detected by the senses are to the wax. And by that, if you look at the typical formula of an analogy, which is A is to B as C is to D, we can see basically here that A and C are detected by the senses. The hats and the coats, or the superficial properties of the wax detected by the senses. And B and D are what tend to be known by the mind as it ties together what is triggered by the senses. Alright? So, take a note. Note take all this. Alright, so if we follow that then, we can make another conclusion about the way the mind works. You see, it tends to be that the mind knows things better than the body does, right? So if we logically look at that, I shouldn't have the comparative then, I should have the then look, if you look at the mind must know itself better than it knows the physical world. Because if you look at the wax, it's pretty easy to see, as we've proven before, it could be the case that some kind of evil genius is creating an optical illusion and deceiving us about the wax. But I cannot doubt the eye that is performing the action of perceiving, even if that what it perceives or is triggered off by the senses is actually a deception. All right. So I can't deny that I'm performing the action of perception, but also I can't deny the fact that my mind is the active agent in the perception. In other words, that my mind knows things better than, or is able to perform the action of perception. So I know that I am perceiving, even if the genius is providing this false stimuli, but I also know that my mind perceives, right? Even if the senses triggering off this false understanding are false, still the mind is actively tying together the falsely generated perceptions of the evil genius that I'm referencing up here, okay? So when we look at the outside world, it can easily be doubted, but when we consider doubt, it tells us more about the nature of the mind. In other words, it tells us this: not only can I not doubt the fact that I'm engaged in the action of perceiving, more importantly, my mind is the knower. It is the perceiver, because perception can't happen without the mind tying together all the plurality of sensations that come to it. All right, take a note. All right, so let's have a look at our success criteria again. Did we outline Descartes' reflection on how we perceive objects? Yes, we did. The senses may take on board all the superficial qualities of an object in its many different shapes and forms, and in fact in its infinite amount of forms, but what ties together an understanding that it is what it is the mind's understanding. All right? Now, the reason why it is the mind alone that perceives the wax or that perceives objects is because, again, you detect the superficial qualities or properties of an object with your senses, but you form an idea or an understanding of what it is only through the mind. So perception is purely mental. And then, because the outside world could be full of false sensory stimulus, right? But you know that you're perceiving it, you're engaged in the action of understanding what it is that has to be perceived from the stimulus, well, then you know that you are a perceiver, but you also know that the mind is involved in perceiving. So you know the quality of the mind, and you know that you are the mind better than you can know anything in the outside world. And that's our 3 success criteria. Cheers.